The language of psychoanalysis. Introduction by Daniel Lagache. The origins and history of this work. Aversion to psychoanalysis sometimes takes the form of disparaging comments about its terminology. Naturally, psychoanalysts do not endorse the abuse or over-hasty use of technical words as a way of covering up woolly thinking. But psychoanalysis, like any trade or science, needs a special vocabulary of its own. It is hard to see how the novelty of the discoveries and conceptualizations of the normal and pathological operation of the mental apparatus could ever have been formulated without resorting to new terms. Moreover, it is true of any scientific discovery that it takes shape not by following the dictates of common sense, but by flying in the face of it. The shocking thing about psychoanalysis is less the theory of the mental functioning of man in his struggle with the world and with himself. Now, ordinary language has no words to evoke mental structures and tendencies that do not exist for common sense. It has therefore been necessary to invent a number of terms, somewhere between 2 and 300, depending on the strictness of one's reading of the texts and one's criteria of technicality. Apart from direct examination of analytical writings, we have few aids in attempting to grasp the meaning of these expressions: glossaries appended to expository works, definitions proposed by the lexicons and dictionaries that have been published over the last 20 or 30 years, but to all intents and purposes, no real specialized and complete reference work. The nearest approach to the present work to date is Dr. Richard F. Sturba's Handbuch der Buch der Psychoanalyse. Circumstances brought the composition of this work to a halt at the letter L and its publication at the entrance Großen Von. I cannot say, Dr. Sturba has written to me, whether this was due to my megalomania or to Hitler's. Dr. Sturba has been kind enough to send me the 5 published installments of his work, which are very hard, if not impossible, to find. Internationaler Psychoanalytischer Verlag, 1936-37. A work quite different in conception may also be mentioned, an alphabetically arranged collection of Freudian texts translated into English, N. Fodor and F. Gaynor. Freud Dictionary of Psychoanalysis, prefaced by Theodore Reich, New York Philosophical Library, 1950. The technical terminology of psychoanalysis is, for the most part, the work of Freud. Its evolution proceeds in step with the elaboration of his discoveries and his thinking. By contrast with the development of classical psychopathology, Freud borrowed little from Latin and Greek. Of course, he did draw from the psychology, psychopathology, and neurophysiology of his time, but by and large his words and expressions come from German common usage, for Freud relied on the resources of his own language. Sometimes a faithful translation is difficult, and the analytic terminology gives an esoteric impression that the original German text does not, while sometimes the resources of the translator's wording tends to conceal its technicality. But this linguistic problem is only of secondary importance. The real difficulty lies elsewhere. His inventiveness as a writer notwithstanding, Freud showed scant interest in perfecting his vocabulary. We shall not here enumerate the types of difficulties encountered. Suffice it to say that the same goes for psychoanalytic phraseology as for many another language. Multiplicity of meaning and semantic overlapping are to be found, while different words may not have very different connotations. We are fighting, then, with words, but not for words. Behind the words we have to find facts, ideas, and the conceptual organization of psychoanalysis, a task made laborious both by the long and fruitful evolution of Freud's own thought and by the size of a literature which, in catalogue, already fills the 9 volumes of Grinstein's bibliography. Moreover, words, like ideas, and together with ideas, are not merely created. They have a fate. They may fall into disuse or lose their currency, giving way to others which are better suited to the needs of fresh orientations in research and theory. The core of Freud's terminology has nevertheless stood the test of time. The few new departures that have been made have been assimilated without modifying its organization or general tone. Consequently, a lexicon such as the present one cannot confine itself to definitions distinguishing between the various meanings that psychoanalytic terms have taken on. The propositions arrived at have to be backed up by a commentary complete with references and quotations. This commentary requires an extensive perusal of the literature, it is true, but what is needed above all is knowledge of the Freudian texts themselves, for all conceptual and terminological development is undoubtedly grounded in them, and moreover the dimensions of the literature will defy the efforts of an individual researcher or even a small team of co-workers. Next, a work of the kind envisaged cannot be based on erudition alone. It calls for specialists with first-hand knowledge of the psychoanalytic experience. At the same time, though setting our sights beyond words on the facts and ideas that lie behind them, we must yet avoid the pitfall of producing an encyclopedia or dictionary of knowledge. Finally, the task is to take stock of usages, to see what light they cast upon one another, and to highlight the problems they raise without attempting to provide solutions. The need for actual innovation is small, limited to such things as proposing more faithful translations. The method appropriate here is above all a historical critical one, after the fashion of André Lalande's vocabulaire technique et critique de la philosophie. Such was our perspective when the notion of a vocabulary of psychoanalysis first began taking concrete form around 1937 to 39. But the data assembled at that time were lost, the circumstances, other tasks, lack of documentation, all meant that the idea lay fallow if not forgotten. Our aims were not completely abandoned, however, in that a variety of projects went forward that dealt to some extent with questions of terminology. Only in 1958 was the original proposal revived. The perspective was still the historical critical one of Lalande's vocabulaire, but the form suggested now was somewhat modified. After some hesitation, the demands of the task and the desire to carry it through both found an apt response in the collaboration of Jean Laplanche and J.B. Pontailly. They were to devote almost 8 years of work to consulting the polishing articles. Obviously, this has been a fruitful labor, but it has also been a demanding and at times even a wearisome one. We read and discussed most of the draft articles together, and I clearly remember the liveliness of those exchanges, whose cordiality did not stop us expressing divergent opinions and adhering to the rule of uncompromising intellectual rigor. Without the pioneering effort of Laplanche and Pontailly, the plan formed 20 years ago would never have been realized in this book. During these years of labor, especially the last ones, the work's orientation has altered somewhat, a mark not of hesitance but of vitality. Thus, Laplanche and Pontailly increasingly centered their research and reflection on Freud's own writings, referring readily to the earliest psychoanalytic texts, including the Project for Scientific Psychology of 1895, which had only just been published in 1958. This added emphasis on the origins of ideas and terms has not, however, reduced the importance accorded to their vicissitudes and their range, so the present work, while it bears the personal stamp of Laplanche and Pontailly, does not betray the principles which inspired the original project. The aim was and remains the answering of a need, a necessity felt by us, acknowledged by others, and hardly ever denied. Our wish is that it may be useful, serving as a work tool for researchers and students in psychoanalysis as well as for other specialists and for the curious readers. However great the care and conscientiousness which have gone into its compilation, the informed, attentive, and demanding reader will doubtless come upon gaps and errors of fact or of interpretation. If such readers communicate their criticisms, these will not be set aside but warmly welcomed and studied with interest. Furthermore, neither the object, nor the content, nor the form of the work would appear to stand in the way of its translation. Comments, criticisms, and translations will help fulfill a second ambition, which is that this book should become not only a tool but also a record of work in progress.